My job is to be the responder, and I find it very difficult. If we use the term of the yeshiva world, we're sitting with the Gedolei Hador. These are the best scholars of our generation, and I don't see any reason to disqualify our friends who are journalists. They know history and how things work sometimes better than historians, so I like to regard some of my journalist friends as my equals, or more than my equals. And we received from Professor Avineri, from from Martin Kramer and Melanie, an insight into, and also from Fiamma, insight into the problem and all of its complexity. And it's even more complex than what they chose to bring to us. What we can say is that we have a dialogue with the past, how we relate to the past, and how it affects our present, and how we look at the future. And when I went to school, they used to say history, we should never regard history as a force in itself, and we should never say that history teaches us this or that. We can learn from history, but history as a force is not something of that works by its own power. So in a certain sense, a little bit, a certain amount of humility and caution is necessary, but just the same, we must not give up. I have been reading about appeasement, and one of the problems is that appeasement transmits a message of weakness. And I will read you from a document that will show this. And also, one of the side effects of the appeasement treaty, the Treaty of Munich, was that all opposition to Hitler from the German general staff was ended at that moment, because they said, what can we do? Here's a genius, you know. And I don't think they ever believed that he was a genius, but morally he undercut the internal opposition within the structure of the German government. What we do have in our time is the idea of accountability of the decision makers. As we look at history, we are much more critical of the decision makers than we ever were, and that, I think, is reflected in our general outlook. I'm going to just say that we received one example of making use of history from the German historians who wrote after World War II. The idea was to face history honestly and dispassionately, and it was called Coping with the Past, or Vergangenheitsbewältigung. In other words, telling the truth and rather than embellishing it. It used to be the tradition in many continental schools to have straight nationalist history, but with the evolution of history writing in Germany, also in certain parts of Europe, the idea of writing contemporary history on an honest basis caught on, and not only in Germany, but it also influenced history writing in Austria. And the idea is a good idea, and we could use some more of this coping with the past. I just wanted to read you a little chapter. There was a letter from Sir Orm Sargent to Wheeler Bennett on the idea of appeasement, and he wrote a letter to Wheeler Bennett in 1946, and Sir Orm Sargent was the equivalent of the Director General of the British Foreign Office in its time, although he was a bureaucrat. And he wrote about the ethics of appeasement. Many a time, both in international affairs as in personal relations, appeasement is the only wise and prudent course to adopt to break an immediate deadlock and at the same time achieve an ulterior aim. It becomes questionable as a method of negotiation only if it can be shown to be immoral. That is, the appeaser sacrifices the rights and interests of a third party and not his own when making his concession, or if it is clearly dangerous, that is, when the concession made seriously undermines the strength of the appeaser, either internally or internationally. This is especially so when the concession has to be repeated, for appeasement then becomes nothing less than blackmail. And lastly, when the whole process of appeasement is just ineffective, when the appeaser, having to make his concession, gets no quid pro quo in return. And then he wrote, you remember the famous passage in Mein Kampf, you probably know it by heart, when Hitler frankly and cynically expounds and justifies his whole method of political and military undermining. If Chamberlain did not know this passage or had forgotten it, he showed criminal negligence. If he knew it and chose to ignore it, he was taking a criminal risk which could not be explained away. This is from within the British establishment. Now, the last part, which is very, very interesting, and I will read it to you, but although Hitler was not propitiated, I do not believe that he was deceived by our servile act of abnegation. He must have interpreted it as proof that his method was succeeding even better than he had dared to expect, and that we have reached quicker than he had anticipated the ultimate stage of demoralization, which is the forerunner of complete capitulation. How could he, poor man, have been expected to understand that this groveling gesture of ours signified, on the contrary, that the worm was at last going to make ready to turn? If he had realized this, he might have hesitated in 1939 to make his next move as soon as was laid down in his timetable. Calculating, Stalin too might have reached other conclusions than he did, but neither Hitler nor Stalin did interpret the Chamberlain intervention at Munich as a warning that they ought to have done, and so our act of appeasement, far from delaying the war or enabling us to enter it in improved circumstances, may well have precisely had the opposite effect. And I wanted to find out what Sargent was referring to. What were the chapters of Hitler's book in Mein Kampf? And I looked in Mein Kampf and I couldn't find it. So at the time I wrote a letter to Professor Eberhard Jäckel in Munich, who wrote the classical book on Hitler's Weltanschauung. And I sent him the letter of Wheeler Bennett, and I asked him, and he gave an interesting answer, and we could say it's a chidush. I do not know a certain passage, neither a famous one as Sir Orm Sargent wrote, nor a particular one as he right, in Mein Kampf, where Hitler justifies his whole method of political and military undermining. Whereas his aims were war of conquest and removal of the Jews, he was not interested in justifying his method. It was rather the very essence of his whole book that his aims were to be attained unconditionally, that is, without previous blackmailing. So the interesting turn which Jäckel said was that it was what Hitler was all about was in everything he wrote and in everything that he did. And I'll just read you a few observations from Sir Neville Henderson, who was the British ambassador to Hitler's Germany before the war. And Henderson was considered to be an avid Nazi sympathizer and in favor of Czechoslovakia's ceding of the Sudetenland. He wrote, verbal and written agreements had absolutely no meaning after he'd gotten what he wanted. He was ready to sign anything. He was ready to guarantee any frontier and to conclude a non-aggression pact with anyone. Each stage was always the last for him until he reached it. As soon as that position was gained, he advanced on to the next. This is all that I would like to contribute. I think that we were privileged to hear these fine speakers. I certainly would not want to add much to what they have said, but would gratefully express my appreciation.
Bravo.